What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Fantasy Football Fellas YouTube channel. My name is Tyler Plath, and before I say anything else, what a week of football we just had in Week 9. We had the Dolphins and the Chiefs kick things off in Germany, two of the highest scoring offenses in the league, and they put up one of the lowest scoring totals on the week. We had shootouts in Atlanta and in Houston. We had blowouts in Cleveland and Baltimore, and we had tight games like in New Orleans and Philly. It was the best week of football that we've had so far this year, and we're here on the Fantasy Football Fellas YouTube channel to break it all down for you, so make sure you're subscribed and have that notification bell turned on so you are notified whenever we post the information that you need to know to win your fantasy leagues this year. And in this video, we're bringing you the best players to add off waivers this week, and our first guy is Ravens running back Keaton Mitchell, who probably will be and should be the top ad this week. He finished as the leading rusher in that Baltimore-Seattle game with 138 rushing yards, and he was outsnapped by Justice Hill, even when Gus Edwards was phased out of the game because it was a blowout. But most of Justice Hill's snaps came in garbage time, so there's a chance that we see Keaton Mitchell more involved in a closer game. And again, with how productive he was, he only had 9 carries, and he put up 138 rushing yards. With how productive he was with his touches, there's even more reason for Keaton Mitchell to be involved in the Ravens offense. And it wouldn't surprise me if we see what we think a 3-man committee between Gus Edwards, Justice Hill, and Keaton Mitchell really becomes a 2-man committee with Keaton Mitchell and Gus Edwards. There's no guarantee, though, that Keaton Mitchell can break out of this 3-man committee and be the lead back, or break out of the 3-man committee and be put into a 2-man committee. But if he does break out of that committee and becomes the lead back, he's a top 20 running back the rest of the year. This is one of these low-risk, high-reward ads that can really make a difference if he continues to succeed. Next is a guy that we discussed last week, and that is Chargers wide receiver Quentin Johnston. Now, this will be out before Monday Night Football, so we'll see how Week 9 fares for Johnston. But the biggest reason for adding him after tonight's game is that Josh Palmer was put on IR on Sunday, and that means that Johnston is the next guy to step up. And in Week 8, when Josh Palmer suffered an injury, and he did play, but obviously was not at 100%, Johnston saw his highest target share on the year. So the guy is starting to emerge in the offense, and with his first-round talent, again, he was a first-round draft pick. He's got talent. With this opportunity now, he should take full advantage of this, making him one of the best ads for Week 10 because of the offense and the situation that he's in. Now let's talk about a couple quarterbacks now, starting with Titans quarterback Will Levis. And Week 9 wasn't necessarily the best fantasy week for Will Levis, but if we learned anything from Week 8 and Week 9, is that Will Levis is the guy for the Tennessee Titans. There is no need for Ryan Tannehill to come back in after he recovers from his injury. Will Levis is the guy moving forward, and I say that as if I'm Ron Carthon, the GM, or Mike Vrabel, the head coach, because they haven't committed to Levis as the full-time starter just yet. But again, it would be the most confusing decision if the Titans put Ryan Tannehill back in as QB1 over Will Levis. But let's turn it back over to fantasy and what Will Levis can be in fantasy football. He can be a top 15 play the rest of the year, and depending on the matchup, he can be a top 12 option. Like the next 2 weeks, Tennessee takes on Tampa Bay and Jacksonville, and both defenses are allowing some of the most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks on the year. So in a year where if you don't have one of the top 7 quarterbacks, right, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar, Tua, Burrow, Herbert, if you don't have one of those 7 quarterbacks, you're probably streaming quarterbacks, or you're extremely frustrated with who you're having to rely on week in and week out. Levis might be one of the better names to consider moving forward in the group of the rest of quarterbacks. And the other quarterback is Kyler Murray, and since I spent a good amount of time on Will Levis, I'm just going to keep this one short and sweet with Kyler Murray. It's Kyler Murray. So we know what he can be in fantasy, playing for his job, because if he doesn't perform, Arizona has all the power, all the right to move on from Kyler Murray and go take a Caleb Williams or Drake May in the draft. Now, we have to acknowledge the possibility that Kyler Murray may not have as many rushing attempts as we've seen in the past just because of his knee injury in the contract that he's on. It is kind of a trend that we see a dip in those rushing attempts, but he's still enough of a red zone threat with his legs and with his arm, to still be a good, productive fantasy quarterback. And again, like I said with Will Levis, in a year where if you don't have any of the top 7 quarterbacks, you're kind of picking and choosing as you go with quarterbacks. Kyler Murray can make a very strong case to be one of the better names in that group as well. Let's shift back over to our skill players, and starting with a running back in the Seattle Seahawks backfield, and that is Zach Charbonnet, who we have been seeing more of the last 2 weeks. In Week 8, Charbonnet outsnapped Ken Walker 34-24, and most people assumed that was because Ken Walker wasn't at 100% health and whatnot. But that was still a game against Cleveland in a pretty close game. And then in Week 9, Charbonnet outsnapped Ken Walker 25-22, but in a blowout. So what does that mean, right? What does this Seattle backfield mean, and what does that look like moving forward? It's not necessarily that Zach Charbonnet is becoming the lead back in that backfield, but it's a 50-50 split, and it's a pretty clear and pretty defined role for both Zach Charbonnet and Kenneth Walker. Ken Walker in Week 9 got 75% of the early down snaps, but it was Charbonnet who got all the third down snaps and all the 2-minute snaps. Those are the roles moving forward. Ken Walker is the early down. Charbonnet is in on third downs and 2-minute drills, giving him some kind of receiving opportunity that Ken Walker probably won't have. There's intrigue all of a sudden for Zach Charbonnet. Again, like I said, in PPR, when he's in on passing downs, there's at least opportunity for him to grab a couple receptions, maybe turn in a touchdown every now and then. Who knows? But Zach Charbonnet, with this shift in this Seahawks backfield, Zach Charbonnet is certainly worth adding at this point in the season. And the newest member of the Detroit Lions now, Donovan Peoples-Jones, is next. And coming off the bye week for the Lions, we may see a decent amount of DPJ in Week 10. He's vying for that wide receiver 2 role in the offense, and he could very well take that over because he's a very capable wide receiver. I mean, it was just last year that we saw him put up over 800 receiving yards on 96 targets. Only reason why he was pushed back to the wide receiver 3 role in Cleveland was because they went out and traded for Elijah Moore. That's the only reason why. Had they not traded for Elijah Moore, he would have still been the wide receiver 2. Now, we'll see how productive this wide receiver 2 role is on the Detroit Lions offense, because you have an established one in Amon-Ra St. Brown. You have an emerging tight end in Sam Laporta, who is looking incredible this year. And you're now in a team that uses their running backs at a top 3 rate between Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. So how much is there for DPJ? We'll have to see. But in a high-powered offense like Detroit, it's worth taking the shot on. Again, a low risk and potentially high reward for adding Donovan Peoples-Jones after he was just traded from Cleveland to Detroit. Vikings wide receiver Brandon Powell is next, and due to some injuries ahead of him, he's the next guy up in that wide receiver room for fantasy purposes. We still don't know Justin Jefferson's status with his hamstring injury. KJ Osborne took a nasty hit and now has a concussion. That wouldn't surprise me if he's out for longer than just Week 10. Could also be out Week 11. TJ Hawkinson, he battled through a rib injury, so that could potentially limit him as well. So in terms of pass catchers, the next man up is Brandon Powell. Powell is seeing most of his targets on 3rd and 4th downs, as that's when the Vikings are typically using their 3 wide receiver sets. And that happened in Week 9 with Atlanta. When KJ Osborne went out, it wasn't Brandon Powell that replaced him. It was Tristan Jackson. But Brandon Powell then came in and played the slot on 3 wide receiver sets. The Vikings have a tough matchup against the Saints next week. But don't be surprised if the Vikings use more 3 wide receiver sets, because it's tough to run the ball against the New Orleans Saints. And they're not exactly like shut down in the secondary. That means more opportunity for Brandon Powell if we see more 3 wide receiver sets. And with no KJ Osborne, there's even more targets opened up in that offense. Sticking in the same Week 9 matchup, just on the other side of the field, Falcons wide receiver KhaDarel Hodge is the next guy we'll discuss. And Hodge's value is pretty contingent on Drake London's health. And that's something to monitor. He missed Week 9 and could potentially miss more. He's taking it day by day. That's what the broadcast said. But in Week 9, in Taylor Heineke's first full start, it was KhaDarel Hodge that led the Falcons wide receivers in snaps and targets. Now, it wasn't like he was funneled targets or anything like that, but it's important to note who Heinicke turns to when a guy like Drake London is out. And the other thing I just remembered, who knows if Taylor Heinicke is the starter in Week 10. They may go back to Desmond Ridder. But again, if there is a wide receiver that steps up with Drake London out, it looks like it's KhaDarel Hodge. It was said on the broadcast on Sunday, Taylor Heinicke mentioned it. He shows the most trust. He has the most chemistry, with KhaDarel Hodge because of all the reps that they've had in practices so far this year. If you have Drake London, I'd at least keep tabs on KhaDarel Hodge, because if London's injury is going to hold him out again in Week 10 and you kind of don't have any other options, or you're just stuck with who you got, KhaDarel Hodge is the next Falcons wide receiver up. And I get if you don't want to bet on Falcons players. I'm borderline in that same boat because Arthur Smith is just trying to get too cute with things. But if you are looking for a Falcons wide receiver, it is KhaDarel Hodge. All right, on to our streamers of the week, 1 quarterback and 1 tight end. And let's start with the quarterback that put on an all-time performance in Joshua Dobbs. And, okay, it was a bit exaggerated all-time performance, but you've heard it all already. He didn't know the cadences. He didn't know his teammates' names. Wasn't even prepped to see the field at all just because he was recently traded to the Minnesota Vikings. But he had to go in because Jaren Hall picked up a concussion. And what did he do? He turned in a quarterback 5 performance before Monday Night Football. It was an amazing performance. And he has a chance to put up similar fantasy numbers as he takes on the Saints, who are top 10 in fantasy points allowed per game to opposing quarterbacks the last 4 weeks. Josh Dobbs, with his rushing ability, with weapons at his disposal, let's say Jefferson comes back, Hawkinson is fully healthy, he then has Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, and TJ Hawkinson to throw to. It's a great situation for Josh Dobbs. And the tight end streamer this week is Gerald Everett. And again, this will be recorded up before Monday Night Football, so we'll see exactly what the Chargers look like without Joshua Palmer in their offense. But the argument can be made as of Monday morning. I want to put that disclaimer in. As of Monday morning, there's an opportunity for an increased role for Gerald Everett. He gets the Lions next week, who are allowing the 3rd most fantasy points to tight ends on average this year. So if he shows out a bit against the Jets, he's certainly an option then in Week 10. But in the case that Gerald Everett doesn't do much and really isn't worth streaming or playing at all or rostering, I should just generalize it as that, you can look for tight ends like Trey McBride or Hunter Henry, who could now be in an increased role himself. That'll do it for this week's top 10 waiver wire ads, and those 10 players that we discussed: Keaton Mitchell, Quentin Johnston, Will Levis, Kyler Murray, Zach Charbonnet, Donovan Peoples-Jones, Brandon Powell, KhaDarel Hodge, Joshua Dobbs, and Gerald Everett, with the Plan B options of Trey McBride and Hunter Henry. Thanks for tuning in, and remember to hit subscribe if you are not, and give this video a like if you enjoyed it. And we will see you on the next one where we break down everything from week 9 on the Fantasy Football Fellas podcast. So again, we will see you then. Deuces.